So you just got your first ball python. You get this guy home, get him set up in their enclosure, get their heat and humidity just right, but what do you feed them? Today I wanted to go over the types of food that your ball python can eat and what sizes would be appropriate for them. Ball pythons are ectothermic, which means that they need heat to be able to digest food. The pros to this is that you are only going to need to feed your ball python typically once a week. Hatchlings maybe a little bit more as they're growing. As they're adults, usually just once a week. Honestly, if you're not breeding them, you can probably get away with even less than that. The con to this is that they don't do very well in colder temperatures, but it's definitely a pro for you because you don't need to feed them quite as much. This is why when your ball python goes off food, it's typically not a big deal, especially for an adult. Size is also a very important factor when determining what to feed your ball python. A lot of people think that they're able to unhinge their jaw. That's not true, but their jaw operates a lot differently than ours. Their jaw is actually disconnected, so if you're looking at me, it would be right here, as if it was also another point of the jaw that I could open. This allows him to get the entire piece of food, which would normally not fit down this snake's mouth. So when determining a prey size for Gwen here, what I should do is take the thickness of her body. We have a frozen thawed here that is just a slight bit bigger than the girth of her body. This one here is a pretty good size for him, but he could probably honestly eat something a little bit bigger. Even Micah here, who's a little bit thinner and smaller than Gwen, would be able to take down a rodent this size. You just really want to just match that up and just make sure that it is about the same size or maybe just a little bit thicker than the thickest part of your snake. You can easily eyeball this. The three main types of prey that you're going to want to feed your ball pythons would be rats, mice, and African soft birds, otherwise known as ASFs. Rats are easily the most common and preferred method. They have a large body fat account, they have a lot of protein to them, they're gonna grow your snake quite a bit faster most likely, and it's just a more healthy meal for them. Also, if you want to breed rats, it's probably one of the more easy ones to do. They're generally very sociable, they typically don't eat their own, they're a lot cleaner than most of the other animals, although you will need to keep up with them if you do breed on your own. Next up would be mice. I use mice mostly for my brand new hatchlings. I usually only try to feed 1 or 2 to them. I also sometimes will feed them to a female that has just laid eggs. Sometimes they won't eat right away. I find if I feed them 1 mouse, they will usually start eating rats the next week with no problem. Mice are a little bit harder to keep though. They cannibalize their own. The males are incredibly aggressive. They won't breed as well if you don't clean their enclosure quite as much either, so you've got to be more on top of it with them. They're just a little bit more of a hassle and they're not as nice to work with. They're a little bit more bitey typically as well, although it's not really anything to worry about with a mouse bite. Rats are less likely to bite you, but when they do, oh, it hurts. And finally, African soft birds. You don't see a lot of breeders do this. This is what they would more likely eat in Africa. This one you don't find for a few different reasons. For one, they still don't provide as good of a meal as a rat does. They are better than a mouse, but if you feed them an African soft bird, they're gonna want African soft birds forever. And they're not exactly common. They're also pretty mean. They're just a little bit harder to work with, though your ball python will eat on those ones a lot better, most likely, but they're probably not gonna eat anything else. This size rat is what we would call a pinky. It's brand new born, within a week old. They are not what I'd probably recommend for your first ball python's meal, although they very well could take it. I find that they usually need to have a little bit of fur on them. I don't know why. I think that it's just something to do with like scent. It just triggers them to eat. This little one right here is a rat pup. These ones have either just opened their eyes or not quite yet. Sometimes one will be open and one won't. This one here is what I would say a ball python would be more inclined to go for. As soon as they start getting fur, that's when you can probably offer them, in my recommendation anyway. All right, and this little one right here is what I would call a rat weanling. We call it that because it's now been weaned off of its mother. It can now have its own solid food. They will still try to nurse from the mom occasionally as well. This is more for probably a little bit more of an established hatchling, one that's been eating, as you're just sizing them up to something like this. These three here are probably classified as small. Sounds like it's not a big meal for a ball python, but honestly most of your juveniles will be eating a lot of these up until they reach maybe around 700-800 grams. Finally, rounding them out would be the mediums to large. Depending on who you buy rats from, they're gonna have probably their own definition of sizing on rats. This one is definitely, I'd say, a large though, whereas these other two, I can see people calling this one a large. I probably would say that's about the small
smallest of a large, whereas this one would probably still be what you'd call a medium. All right, and this big chunker here is what I'd probably call a jumbo. Usually your males reach this size. There's not too many ball pythons that you're gonna feed a rat this size to. This is usually too big for most ball pythons, and you don't wanna go too big, even though sometimes they might try and take it down. Usually what I find is if they had a way too big meal and they actually took it down, they're going to skip for a while after that. I don't recommend this for very many ball python sizes. I don't have a lot of mice. I only keep them for my hatchlings. But real quick, I know we didn't capture it on camera, but one of these moms literally put the baby in my hand. That's never happened, and I literally just went on saying how mice aren't as sociable as rats. I only have a few pretty much just to feed my hatchlings. I usually still have to buy some from my local pet store. These are more of an adult mouse, the bigger mice, so I don't have all the sizes, quote unquote, of mice other than babies and big ones. Usually with the mice, you want to go what they call a hopper for the babies. That's too real small to hurt any ball python, yet they're fast and they jump around and they annoy your ball python, which is a good thing because then he or she gets mad and then bites at it and eventually eats it because it's like, I'm tired of you. And that's why I keep them. I find that their first meal takes really well, and then I can transition them usually with no problem into the rats. But I've had some that just want to stick on mice for a long time, but I have never had an issue eventually switching them to rats. So next you need to decide, or your snake needs to decide for you, whether it is going to eat live or frozen thawed. There's certainly pros and cons to both. Your snake is more likely going to have a better feeding response when you feed live. It's typically a little bit easier to do. However, some of the cons there would be that, you know, if you're squeamish, you have to see them get eaten. The rodent will die fairly quickly from the constriction. The other big one is that the rodent can seriously harm or even kill your snake. You never want to leave a live rodent unattended with your snake. If you really think about it, especially with ball pythons, they are ambush hunters. They're big bodied, they're not going to be able to outrun a rodent, and they're not going to be able to outmaneuver it beyond that initial strike. The rodent, if it gets on its back, for example, this definitely got the advantage, and it will very, very, very quickly harm or kill your snake. Another con would be if you buy these from a pet store and you're not breeding them yourself, you might end up with a pet rat. Your snake might not always want to eat. If you don't have another snake to take that meal, what are you going to do with it? If you keep snakes, you should always be prepared to keep some rats on hand. Not a bunch. Maybe you just keep them, the ones that they don't eat, in a small little 10-gallon aquarium with some bottles in there for them, or some water bowls and some food. If they're just feeders, you can feed them dog food, so just keep that in mind as well. But it's something that you should just be prepared for it. Some pros of the frozen thawed is that, well, obviously it's not going to hurt your snake. You don't have to watch the rodent die. You don't have to worry about it. You just have to get a pair of tongs, warm it up, and dangle it in front of there. Some of the cons are just that. You have to warm it up. It takes some time. You're gonna wanna do this usually by putting it in some sort of bag, putting it in like the bathtub with a lot of hot water around it, or in your sink with a lot of hot water on it. Again, that means that you're gonna have to keep rats in a freezer. Try sneaking that by your mom. Another con would be if your snake does not choose to eat it, it was pretty much just wasted. You really aren't supposed to refreeze them. You might be able to get away with it once, but when I was doing frozen thawed, I ended up unthawing less than what I needed just in case they didn't eat, and if they did eat, then I'd have to go do more. This ended up being pretty time consuming. That's why I personally do live now, although I do keep some frozen thawed on hand for certain snakes.
If you'd like to check out our previous video where we talk about trying to get a picky ball python to eat, you can check that out right here.